Good evening, everyone. It is Dragon. Welcome back to another night of shared stories and quiet adventures. Tonight, I would love to tell you the entire story of Greek mythology, from the very first stirrings of chaos all the way to the fall of famous heroes, told in a calm and steady order of events. I am a mythology nerd at heart, and there is always room on the shelf for one more book about the old gods and their wild stories. So tonight we will open that book together and walk through it from the first page to the last. If you like these stories, please comment and subscribe. It is the easiest way to support the channel, and I always appreciate it. Maybe tell me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. I love knowing who is out there on the other side of the story. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let us begin. Before there were gods with clear faces and temples of white stone, before there were prayers or sacrifices or the smoke of burnt offerings, there was a story that the Greeks told about the very first moment of existence. They did not begin with a god who shaped the world like a potter with clay. They began with something stranger, something older, something that is almost not a thing at all. They called it chaos. Chaos in their tongue did not mean confusion or noise, not at first. It meant a yawning gap, an open mouth, a vast empty space that yawns between things. It was the first condition of being, the dark gulf in which nothing had yet taken stable form. If you imagine a night sky with no stars, no moon, not even the idea of light, then remove the sky as well and leave only a sense of endless falling that comes close to what they pictured. Out of this dark, open gulf, beings began to appear. They are not born in the way mortal children are born, with mothers and fathers and midwives. They arise as if the universe begins to remember itself. First comes Gaia, the broad-breasted earth, solid and firm where chaos was hollow. She is not only soil and stone, she is the ground itself, the vast body upon which everything else will stand. When the poets say her name, they picture the land of Greece with its rough hills and narrow valleys, but they also think of every shore and mountain and field in the world. Along with Gaia appears deep Tartaros, far below, not merely a pit but a region of the cosmos as far beneath the earth as the sky is above it. Later stories will place the worst of the defeated gods and monsters there, bound in chains in an underworld even deeper than the realm of the dead. And from chaos comes also dark night, whom they call Nyx. And from night comes a line of strange children, sleep and death, fate and doom, dreams that creep through the crack of a door, and blame that follows an unjust deed. To the Greek mind, even such shadowy things must have a family tree. There is also Eros, not the later playful boy with arrows, but a very old presence, the force of attraction that draws together what had been separate. Eros in this first sense is the desire that pulls earth and sky toward each other, that brings beings into contact so that new forms can arise. It is a quiet and powerful thing, a pressure that moves the story forward. Gaia, solid and patient, does not wait for a partner. She brings forth the high hills and the sea with its restless waves, and then she produces the sky itself. They call him Uranos, the starry heaven. He is the dome that stretches over her, close and oppressive. In this early imagination, the cosmos is not a globe floating in space. It is a great flat disk of earth, covered by a solid roof of sky, surrounded at the edges by a vast river they name Okeanos, which flows forever around the rim of the world. Uranos lies over Gaia, and the two are joined. From their union come the Titans, a powerful race who will rule before the Olympian gods. There are 12 in the oldest lists. There is Okeanos, the encircling stream, and Tethys, the mother of rivers and springs. There is Hyperion, father of the sun, and Theia, associated with brightness. There is Koios, linked to the axis of the heavens, and Phoebe, whose name carries the light of the moon. Then there are others whose names will mark great forces of nature and time itself. Among them are Rhea, queenly and nurturing, and Themis, who embodies right order and divine law. And there is Kronos, the youngest, sharp-minded and dangerous. Gaia and Uranos also have other children, rougher and more frightening. There are the Cyclopes, gigantic craftsmen with a single round eye set in their foreheads, who later will forge thunder and lightning. There are also the 100-handers, huge beings with 50 heads and 100 arms each, too strong and too strange for the comfort of their father. Uranos looks upon these last children with horror. The world has become crowded and unruly. Some of what has come into being does not please him, so he does something which is at once divine and brutally familiar. He forces these children back into the body of Gaia, hiding them in her depths, pressing them down so that they can never see the light of day. The poets say that Gaia groans under the weight of her imprisoned offspring. Imagine mountains that are not only stone but ribs and vertebrae, and inside them vast hands pushing upward, straining against the crust of the world. The whole earth shudders. The suffering of Gaia becomes a kind of cosmic injustice. The mother of all things is cramped and burdened by her own children, denied the chance to let them stand beneath the sky. No one is there to hear her but her own children, the Titans. She speaks to them and shows them a plan. Gaia is not only suffering, she is also resourceful. From her own substance, she brings forth hard grey flint and shapes from it a great sickle, a curved blade with a sharp biting edge. She asks which of her sons will take the weapon and stand against their father. Most of the Titans hesitate. Uranos is the sky itself. To rise against him is to rise against the order of things as they have always been. Only Kronos, the youngest, steps forward. In later ages, the Greeks will associate Kronos with time, the devourer, the slow and patient destroyer of all things. Here, at the beginning, he is the bold child who dares what his brothers will not. With the help of Gaia, Kronos sets an ambush. The scene is both intimate and cosmic. Uranos comes to lie with Gaia, as he has always done, drawing the sky close over the face of the earth. At that moment, Kronos rises from his hiding place, sickle in hand, and strikes. The blade bites into the flesh of the sky. Uranos is wounded and his blood falls, not in gentle drops but in torrents that splash upon the earth. From those drops of blood that soak into Gaia, new beings are born. The Furies, or Erinyes, arise, goddesses who pursue those who shed kindred blood. They are the personification of righteous vengeance for family murder. Giants also spring from that blood, fierce and violent, who will later challenge the Olympian gods. From other drops that fall near the sea come the ash tree nymphs, and from the part that is cast into the waters near Cyprus rises a figure who will later be known across the world. The story says that the severed part falls into the foam of the sea and drifts. Around it the water froths and swirls. Out of that white foam a woman emerges, both terrible and beautiful. She is Aphrodite, the goddess of love and desire, born in a way that links her forever to the raw, creative, and destructive power of the sea and of severed passion. Later poets will tell other versions of her birth, but this one remains the oldest and strangest. Uranus, in his pain, curses his son. He calls him a wretch and declares that he, too, will be overthrown by his own child. It is a prophecy that binds itself to the story like a hook. In Greek thought, prophecies are not simple predictions. They are threads that twist themselves into the lives of those they concern. Kronos has won, but he has also inherited his father's doom. Now the sky is lifted away from the earth. Uranus no longer lies pressed over Gaia. The world has room to breathe. Kronos frees his Titan brothers and sisters and takes the place of his father as king of the cosmos. For a time there is peace. The Greeks have a name for this period. They call it the Age of Kronos, a golden age when men live simple lives close to the earth, without war or toil. That vision of a lost golden age, a time of ease and innocence that lies far behind the present, will echo in many cultures. Yet even in this golden age, the seeds of fear grow. Kronos has heard the prophecy of his father. He knows that one of his own children will rise against him in turn. So when Rhea bears him a child, he does something that chills even the immortal spine. As each baby is born, Kronos takes it and swallows it whole. The names of the swallowed children are familiar to us now. There is Hestia, goddess of the hearth. There is Demeter, of grain and harvest. There is Hera, who will one day be queen of the gods. There is Hades, dark master of the underworld, and Poseidon, lord of the sea. Each one of them, in these earliest days, goes straight from the arms of their mother into the throat of their father, vanishing into the darkness of his belly. Rhea is left grieving. She moves through the halls of the Titans with empty arms and a heart that grows heavier with each birth. She knows that her children still live inside Kronos, for gods are not so easily destroyed, but that knowledge is a cruel comfort. She begins to plan, just as Gaia once planned. When she is ready to bear another child, she seeks counsel from her mother and from the earth itself. The next child will not be so easily devoured. It is on the edge of this decision, with Kronos seated at the center of his uneasy realm and Rhea heavy with the future, that the first age of gods pauses like a breath drawn in before a storm. Rhea carried her last child beneath her heart with a mixture of dread and stubborn hope. She knew the pattern, the pain of birth, the brief breath of wonder at a new tiny face, then the heavy steps of Kronos approaching, his shadow filling the doorway, his hand reaching out. The child would vanish into his mouth, and the silence afterward would be worse than any scream. The halls of the Titans were not poor or dim. Think of a world still young, with mountains that seem closer to the sky, with rivers that run bright and clear, with no temples yet but countless sacred groves. Kronos and Rhea ruled from a high place where earth and air met, surrounded by their Titan kin. In later ages, poets would speak of this time as a golden age, when men did not yet have to plow or sow, when fruit came easily to hand and people lived long and peaceful lives. Somewhere beneath that soft memory lies the truth that the gods themselves were uneasy because their king was afraid of his own children. When the time came for Rhea to give birth again, she did not remain in the familiar halls. She went down from the high throne and across the world, seeking a place where the eyes of Kronos did not easily reach. The stories send her to the island of Crete, in the center of the wine-dark sea. Crete in Greek imagination is an old land full of caves and rugged peaks, with goats leaping along ridges and small fertile plains between rocky heights. There, on a mountain that some call Dicte and others Ida, Rhea found a hidden cave. Inside that cave, the air was cool and smelled of stone and damp earth. The walls caught the flicker of torchlight and answered with flickers of their own, as if the mountain were awake and watching. Here Rhea labored and bore a son. The baby cried, a thin and fierce sound, and she looked down at him with a mix of fierce love and hard purpose. This one she would not surrender. She named him Zeus. Around her, helpful spirits moved. Later stories say that a band of young warriors, called the Curetes, guarded the cave. They danced in armed ranks outside and clashed their shields with their swords whenever the baby cried, drowning the sound so that nothing reached the ears of Kronos. Others say that nymphs tended the child, nymphs whose names still echo in fragments of song and inscription, like Adrastea and Ida, daughters of the earth and the rain. As for his food, the poets paint a vivid picture. Zeus did not drink from the breast of Rhea, for she had to return to the court of Kronos and play the part of grieving mother once again. Instead, a divine goat named Amalthea nursed the child. Her horns were strong and curved, her milk rich as cream. In some versions, when Zeus grew older and grateful, he honored Amalthea by placing her among the stars as the constellation of the goat, which we call Capricorn. In others, one of her horns breaks and becomes the cornucopia, the horn of plenty, which spills out endless produce for those favored by the gods. While the hidden child grew in his cave, Rhea had to perform a cruel trick. She wrapped a stone in baby clothes and placed it in the cradle where Zeus should have been. Then she called Kronos. The Titan king came, his eyes filled with the same anxious hunger that had guided him since he first heard his father's curse. Without a word, he took the swaddled shape and swallowed it down. So frantic was his fear that he did not notice the weight or the silence. The stone passed into his belly and joined the host of half-living children who waited inside him. In Greek thought there is a strange comfort in this grotesque scene. The swallowed gods are not dead. They remain entire and awake, held in a kind of living prison. When later Zeus forces Kronos to release them, they will emerge fully grown. This curious detail reflects a strong idea in Greek religion. A god may be hidden, bound, or cast down, but true divinity cannot be easily ended. Years passed in the cave on Crete. We can imagine the young Zeus scrambling over rocks, learning the feel of the wind on the mountain, the taste of fresh goat milk and honey, the sound of distant waves pounding against the shore below. Some tales say that he was guarded by sacred bees who brought him honey straight from their hives. In some shrines on Crete, archaeologists have found offerings to bee goddesses and to a highest god who was believed to have spent his youth there. The myth and the earth answer each other like echo and call. Rhea carried her last child beneath her heart with a mixture of dread and stubborn hope. She knew the pattern, the pain of birth, the brief breath of wonder at a new tiny face, then the heavy steps of Kronos approaching, his shadow filling the doorway, his hand reaching out. The child would vanish into his mouth, and the silence afterward would be worse than any scream. The halls of the Titans were not poor or dim. Think of a world still young, with mountains that seem closer to the sky, with rivers that run bright and clear, with no temples yet but countless sacred groves. Kronos and Rhea ruled from a high place where earth and air met, surrounded by their Titan kin. In later ages, poets would speak of this time as a golden age, when men did not yet have to plow or sow, when fruit came easily to hand and people lived long and peaceful lives. Somewhere beneath that soft memory lies the truth that the gods themselves were uneasy, because their king was afraid of his own children. When the time came for Rhea to give birth again, she did not remain in the familiar halls. She went down from the high throne and across the world, seeking a place where the eyes of Kronos did not easily reach. The stories send her to the island of Crete, in the center of the wine-dark sea. Crete in Greek imagination is an old land, full of caves and rugged peaks, with goats leaping along ridges and small fertile plains between rocky heights. There, on a mountain that some call Dicte and others Ida, Rhea found a hidden cave. Inside that cave, the air was cool and smelled of stone and damp earth. The walls caught the flicker of torchlight and answered with flickers of their own, as if the mountain were awake and watching. Here Rhea labored and bore a son. The baby cried, a thin and fierce sound, and she looked down at him with a mix of fierce love and hard purpose. This one she would not surrender. She named him Zeus. Around her, helpful spirits moved. Later stories say that a band of young warriors, called the Curetes, guarded the cave. They danced in armed ranks outside and clashed their shields with their swords whenever the baby cried, drowning the sound so that nothing reached the ears of Kronos. Others say that nymphs tended the child, nymphs whose names still echo in fragments of song and inscription, like Adrastea and Ida, daughters of the earth and the rain. As for his food, the poets paint a vivid picture. Zeus did not drink from the breast of Rhea, for she had to return to the court of Kronos and play the part of grieving mother once again. Instead, a divine goat named Amalthea nursed the child. Her horns were strong and curved, her milk rich as cream. In some versions, when Zeus grew older and grateful, he honored Amalthea by placing her among the stars as the constellation of the goat, which we call Capricorn. In others, one of her horns breaks and becomes the cornucopia, the horn of plenty, which spills out endless produce for those favored by the gods. While the hidden child grew in his cave, Rhea had to perform a cruel trick. She wrapped a stone in baby clothes and placed it in the cradle where Zeus should have been. Then she called Kronos. The Titan king came, his eyes filled with the same anxious hunger that had guided him since he first heard his father's curse. Without a word, he took the swaddled shape and swallowed it down. So frantic was his fear that he did not notice the weight or the silence. The stone passed into his belly and joined the host of half-living children who waited inside him. In Greek thought, there is a strange comfort in this grotesque scene. The swallowed gods are not dead. They remain entire and awake, held in a kind of living prison. When later Zeus forces Kronos to release them, they will emerge fully grown. This curious detail reflects a strong idea in Greek religion. A god may be hidden, bound, or cast down, but true divinity cannot be easily ended. Years passed in the cave on Crete. We can imagine the young Zeus scrambling over rocks, learning the feel of the wind on the mountain, the taste of fresh goat milk and honey, the sound of distant waves pounding against the shore below. Some tales say that he was guarded by sacred bees who brought him honey straight from their hives. In some shrines on Crete, archaeologists have found offerings to bee goddesses and to a highest god who was believed to have spent his youth there. The myth and the earth answer each other like echo and call. As Zeus grew, he learned more than how to run and climb. His protectors told him the story of his birth, of his brothers and sisters trapped in the body of Kronos, and of the first rebellion when Kronos took up the sickle of Gaia and cut down his own father. The pattern of violence and fear lay clear before him. It was not enough to survive. If he wanted true freedom, the cycle had to be broken, or at least bent into a new shape. Eventually, the time came when Zeus could no longer remain hidden. He left Crete and returned to the wider world, but he did so in disguise. In many Greek myths, gods favor disguise. They come as strangers, as shepherds, as beggars. Even the greatest of them knows that to move unseen is sometimes safer than to stride openly in shining armor. Zeus sought allies. Among the first was a Titaness named Metis. Her name means simple cunning, the kind of quick cleverness that can twist out of impossible traps. Some traditions call her the first wife of Zeus. Others make her an advisor and companion. Together they devised a plan that would work not by brute force but by mind and patient poison. Meti brewed a special drink, a mixture of herbs and perhaps earth itself, which would not kill but would cause whoever drank it to vomit up what they had swallowed before. Then Zeus, still unrecognized by Kronos, came to serve as a cupbearer at a divine banquet. At these feasts, the great ones of that age reclined on couches, drank from goblets of shining metal, and listened to music and song. Kronos, seated at the center, raised his cup again and again. Zeus poured the poisoned mixture into his father's drink and watched as the Titan king swallowed it. The effect was sudden and terrible. Kronos began to convulse. His great body heaved as if the world itself were shaking. One by one he spat forth the children he had swallowed long ago. First came Hestia, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon, each adult and strong, as if they had been growing quietly in the darkness all this time. Finally, he retched out the stone that had been wrapped in baby clothes and swallowed in place of Zeus. This stone would later be placed at Delphi as a sacred object, a marker of the center of the world, polished by centuries of pilgrims who touched it with their hands. Now the true younger generation of gods stood free in the light. They gathered around Zeus, who revealed himself as their brother and leader. At once the cosmos slid into a new crisis, because Kronos still held power, and the older Titans would not relinquish their rule without a fight. What followed was called the Titanomachy, the War of Titans, a clash that shook heaven and earth. For 10 years, according to Hesiod, the battle raged without clear victory. On one side stood Kronos and most of the Titans, stationed on Mount Othrys. On the other side stood Zeus and his freed brothers and sisters, along with a few Titans who chose to join them, such as the thoughtful ocean and the light-bringing Helios in some later versions. Zeus and his allies took their stand on Mount Olympos, a peak in northern Greece that later would be known as the home of the gods. The ground between these two mountains became a battlefield that stretched across the sky and beneath the soil. The very elements were weapons. Lightning flashed as Zeus hurled bolt after bolt, splitting the air with white fire. The sea rose in walls of water. The earth opened in cracks that spat steam and flame. Volcanic eruptions and thunderstorms were imagined as echoes of that ancient war. For a long time, the struggle remained even. The Titans were huge and powerful, children of Gaia and Uranos, familiar with the raw forces of the world. The younger gods were swift and determined, but they lacked the one thing that would tip the balance. At last, Gaia herself intervened again. She counseled Zeus that victory would come only if he released the Cyclopes and the 100-handers whom Kronos had shut away in Tartaros. So Zeus descended to the deep. In Greek thought, Tartaros is not only a pit but a vast region beneath even the house of Hades, where light scarcely reaches and the air is thick and heavy. There the Cyclopes labored in chains, and the 100-handers lay bound, their many arms pinned. Zeus broke their chains and offered them freedom and honor in return for their help. The Cyclopes agreed and set to work. From their forges came weapons unlike any seen before. For Zeus they fashioned the thunderbolt, a shaft of lightning he could wield at will, a symbol of sudden justice and overwhelming power. For Poseidon they made the trident, which could crack the earth or stir the sea to fury. For Hades they crafted a helm that made its wearer unseen, the cap of invisibility, which allowed the dark god to move unheard even among enemies. The 100-handers also joined Zeus. These strange beings, with 50 heads and 100 arms each, became living engines of war. In the final assault, they took up huge rocks and hurled them in storms at the Titans, burying them under avalanches of stone. With these allies, the war turned. The sky was torn by lightning, the sea by storms, the land by quakes. In the end, the Titans fell. Those who had fought against Zeus were seized and cast down into Tartaros, where they were bound with chains as iron hard as the bones of the earth. The 100-handers stood watch over them as wardens, ensuring that they would not rise again. Not every Titan was punished. Some, like Theseus and Mnemosyne, became part of the new order under Zeus. Others, like Ocean, were left to carry on their ancient duties. This mixture of downfall and survival shows how Greek myth keeps both change and continuity together. The world is remade, but not every old power is swept away. With the Titans defeated, Zeus and his brothers divided the realms of the cosmos by lot. Zeus took the sky and the storm and the high peaks. Poseidon took the sea with its depths and its creatures. Hades took the underworld, the house of the dead, a place beneath the earth where souls drifted after life. The earth itself and the wide open sky above remained common ground, shared by all. This division, though made by chance in the story, reflects the three great zones of the Greek universe. Zeus now sat upon his throne on Olympos. Around him gathered the gods who would become familiar to every child in Greece. Hera as queen, proud and sharp-eyed. Athena, who would soon spring fully armed from his head. Apollo and Artemis, twin lights of sun and moon in later tales. Hermes, quick-footed messenger and guide of souls. The family was not yet complete, but the shape of the Olympian court had begun to form. Yet even in victory, Zeus was not beyond challenge. From the earth and from the rage of Gaia at the fate of her Titan children there rose another foe, Typhon, a monstrous being of such size and horror that later writers struggled to describe him. One said that his hands reached to the west and east at once, that his heads were like dragons, that his voice contained many sounds, from roaring beasts to human speech. Typhon stormed the sky, threatening to unseat Zeus and tear apart the new order. The battle between Zeus and Typhon was said to be so fierce that it scorched the landscape of Sicily and gave birth to the fires beneath Mount Etna. In the end, Zeus triumphed. He hurled thunderbolt after thunderbolt, and Typhon fell, trapped beneath the mountain where his struggles still send tremors through the ground and his breath rises in smoke. Only now could Zeus truly claim the title of King of gods and men. The long story of rebellions was, for a time, quiet. Kronos had overthrown Uranus. Zeus had overthrown Kronos. The wheel had turned twice. For a while at least it would stop. By the time Zeus sat firmly on his throne, the world of Greek myth had begun to take the shape that later poets and storytellers knew so well. The roaring age of titans and ancient monsters gave way to something more ordered, though it was an order enforced by thunder and by fear. The sky had a king, the sea had a lord, the dead had a keeper. The earth itself was still vast and old, but now its sacred places had names that a mortal might recognize. High above all stood Olympos. The Greeks looked at the tallest peaks that pierced the northern sky and imagined that somewhere above those roots of stone there was a level place, a bright summit that never knew snow or storm. On that height the gods lived in halls that shone with light. Wind and cloud hid the summit from mortal eyes, but the imagination of story climbed freely. In those halls the Olympian gods gathered. Zeus sat upon a throne that blazed when he grew angry. Around him moved a family whose members were as sharply drawn as characters in any saga. Hera, his sister and wife, sat beside him, regal and sharp-sighted, the goddess of marriage and the jealous guardian of its bonds. Athena, born later from his head in a burst of pain and light, would become the goddess of wisdom and of war guided by strategy instead of rage. Apollo carried the clear light of the sun and the art of music and prophecy. Artemis walked under the moon, the huntress who favored the company of wild animals and young girls. Hermes moved quickly along the roads, patron of shepherds and merchants and thieves, a messenger whose feet barely touched the ground. Aphrodite stirred the hearts of gods and mortals alike with the strange, sweet violence of desire. They feasted, they quarreled, they fell in love and in resentment, and over time priests and poets imagined for them an entire courtly life. They drank nectar and ate ambrosia, food that kept them forever young. Muses sang, the Graces danced. Yet for all the beauty of this divine life, one question lay at its center. How would these gods govern the world below, where human beings had begun to appear in fragile, hungry numbers? In Greek thought, humans were not an afterthought. They were the ones who brought offerings, built altars, poured out wine, and lit fires that sent smoke up to the sky. The link between gods and mortals was not made of affection. It was made of exchange and obligation. No figure embodies this better than Prometheus. Prometheus was a titan, a son of Iapetos and the nymph Clymene, and his name means forethought. He was clever, watchful, and unusually fond of the small, shivering creatures who now walked the earth. In the earliest stories, humans are not yet equipped for survival. They lack fire, strong tools, settled houses. Fire belonged to the gods, who kept it in their halls as a secret of power. At a place called Mekone, the gods and mortals gathered to agree on how sacrifices would work. Sacrifice was the center of Greek ritual. Animals would be slain, their meat cooked and shared, their smoke rising toward the heavens. But there had to be a pattern, a division that both sides recognized as binding. Prometheus prepared the sacrifice, and he did so with deliberate trickery. He took a fine ox and cut it into 2 portions. In one portion he placed the best cuts of meat, the rich flesh and organs, then wrapped it in the unappealing skin and stomach of the animal. In the other portion he gathered bones, white and bare, and covered them with a lavish layer of shining fat that gleamed and smelled rich. Then he laid both before Zeus and invited the king of the gods to choose which share would belong to the gods forever. Zeus saw the trick. The stories usually admit this. He was not fooled in the way a fool is fooled. He knew that the portion that looked so fine from the outside was bone within, but he also knew that if he chose it and declared it the gods' share, then a pattern would be set. From that day on, mortals would keep the best meat and burn the bones wrapped in fat upon the altars. Zeus chose the plate of bones and fat and claimed it with a stern glance. The choice was both a concession and a trap. Humans would eat well at their sacrifices, but Zeus now had cause for anger. The relationship between the king of the gods and Prometheus, and through him all humankind, would never again be simple. The next step in the quarrel was theft. Prometheus saw that without fire, humans remained weak. They could not harden metal, bake clay, or roast the very meat that sacrifice had left them. In one version of the tale, Zeus deliberately withheld fire to keep humans in their place. In another, fire simply belonged to the divine world and never drifted down to earth on its own. So Prometheus stole it. When at last the rain stopped and the waters receded, their chest came to rest on a mountain, often named as Parnassos. They stepped out into a silent world. The temples were empty, the fields were bare. Smoke no longer rose from any hearth. They prayed to Themis, goddess of divine law, asking how they might restore the human race. The answer came in a riddle. They were told to cover their heads and cast the bones of their mother over their shoulders. At first this seemed a command to commit a new act of impiety. Then they understood. Their mother was Gaia, the earth. Her bones were stones. So Deucalion and Pyrrha picked up rocks and threw them behind them as they walked. The stones that Deucalion cast became men. The stones that Pyrrha cast became women. In this way, according to the story, the new human race was born from something hard and enduring, suited to a world that would now include toil and grief as well as joy. From these tales, a pattern of law and punishment emerges. Zeus does not simply throw thunder for amusement. He defends certain rules. Guests are sacred, oaths are serious. Murder within the family is almost never forgiven. The gods walk among mortals in disguise to test them. These ideas shaped how Greeks saw their own behavior. A stranger at the door might be a god. A promise sworn by the river Styx, the dark stream that flows around the deepest part of the underworld, could not be broken without terrible cost. Certain places on earth became crossroads, where divine order and mortal life touched. At Delphi, high on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, springs burst from the rock, and a thin mist hung in the air. There, it was said, Apollo had slain an ancient serpent and claimed the place as his own. A temple rose there, and inside a priestess called the Pythia would sit over a fissure in the earth, inhale sweet vapors, and speak in riddling phrases that priests interpreted as the voice of the god. The stone that Kronos once swallowed in place of Zeus was believed to rest there, shaped and polished, marking the navel of the world, the point from which all distances were reckoned. At Olympia, in the western Peloponnesos, another sanctuary grew, dedicated to Zeus. There were altars and statues and groves, but also something different. Every 4 years, men from many cities would gather there to run, to wrestle, to throw the discus, to race in chariots. Wars paused for the sake of these games. Victors would return home crowned with olive leaves, their names recorded for posterity. The games were an offering in themselves, a show of strength and skill performed under the eye of the god. In quiet villages, too, there were smaller altars, simple stones plastered with old soot from countless sacrifices, and little images of Hermes or Apollo at crossroads or near fountains. Law and punishment were not abstract ideas stored in distant myths. They lived in each of these places, in each story that warned what befell those who mocked guessed right or boasted beyond measure. Above it all, the gods of Olympus watched and judged, dealing out honor or ruin in ways that often seemed crooked or hard. Yet within that crookedness lay the guiding thread of their order, an order that bound mortals to the divine through fear, desire, and the hope that a sacrifice might yet tip the scales. By the time the gods had settled into their bright halls on Olympos and mortals had learned to live with both sacrifice and sorrow, the world of Greek myth entered a new kind of story. The sky had its king, the sea its lord, the underworld its patient ruler. What remained was the long and tangled age when the gods and mortals mingled in a more direct and dangerous way, and from that mingling came the figures that would haunt the memories of Greece for as long as people told stories. These were the heroes. A hero in Greek thought was not a gentle champion in shining armor. Heroes were larger than life, often born from a union between god and mortal, burning with pride and fierce temper, as much as with courage. Villages and cities claimed them as founders, built shrines over their supposed graves, and called on them for protection. Their lives were not examples of moral perfection, but powerful warnings and models, showing what it meant to stand halfway between the divine and the human. First among them in fame and in raw force was Heracles. His story begins, like so many stories in Greek myth, with the restless desire of Zeus. In the city of Thebes, there lived a woman named Alcmene, wise and beautiful, married to Amphitryon, a respectable man of noble blood. Zeus looked down and desired her. He waited until Amphitryon was away on campaign, then took on the appearance of her husband, even copying his voice, and came to her bed. That night lasted longer than any mortal night. The next day the real Amphitryon returned, and Alcmene lay with him as well, confused but dutiful. From that double union, Alcmene conceived twins. One, Iphicles, was mortal, son of Amphitryon. The other was Heracles, son of Zeus. Before the child was born, Zeus boasted in the hearing of the other gods that a descendant of his would be born that very day, who would rule over all around him. Hera, who had grown tired of her husband's affairs and of the line of bastards that sprang from them, heard this and did not forget. She delayed the birth of Heracles by interfering with the goddess who oversees labor, and she hastened the birth of another child, Eurystheus, from a different branch of the same family. When Heracles at last came into the world, crying with the fierce voice he would carry all his life, Zeus was forced to keep his word in a crooked fashion. Eurystheus would be the king whom Heracles must serve. From the very beginning, the greatest of heroes was bound to a weaker relative who would command him in the name of fate. The baby Heracles did not have a gentle infancy. Hera, still raging, sent 2 serpents to kill him in his cradle. Alcmene awoke to hear the hiss of coiling bodies and the startled cry of Iphicles, but when she ran to the room, she found a sight that would be painted and carved for centuries. Iphicles cowered in the corner. Heracles sat in the straw, 1 serpent in each hand, strangled and limp, his small face calm and puzzled, as if he wondered why his toys had stopped moving. Time passed. Heracles grew into a man whose strength did not fit inside ordinary life. Teachers tried to tame him. He learned music, archery, wrestling, chariot driving, yet his temper was unsteady and his power dangerous. In one version of the tale, he struck and killed his music teacher with the instrument in a burst of rage. The early Greeks saw this not as an excuse to cast him aside, but as a sign that such force could not be contained by simple lessons. It needed a wider stage. So came the famous labors. Through the spite of Hera and the fearful orders of Eurystheus, Heracles was tasked with a series of nearly impossible deeds. The Nemean lion, a beast whose hide no ordinary weapon could pierce, had to be slain. Heracles strangled it with his bare hands, then used its own claws to cut off its skin and wore the pelt like a cloak, its head as a hood, a savage symbol that travelers and potters knew at a glance. Then there was the Lernaean Hydra, a many-headed serpent lurking in a swamp, each head sprouting 2 more when cut off. Heracles, with the help of his nephew Iolaus, burned the necks as he cut, so that new heads could not grow. The central head was immortal, so he buried it under a heavy stone. In another labor, he captured the Erymanthian boar, a huge wild animal that ravaged the countryside, and dragged it alive to Eurystheus, who hid in terror in a storage jar when he saw it. In still another, he cleaned the Augean stables in a single day, not with a broom but by diverting the course of a river, a reminder that sometimes clever use of the world is stronger than brute effort. Each labor has its local setting: Nemea, Lerna, Mount Erymanthos, the stables of Elis. In older village tales, these were separate legends about unnamed strong men facing local monsters. Over time, the Greeks stitched them into a single cloak of story around the shoulders of Heracles. In doing so, they turned him into a hero whose wanderings reached every corner of their world. If you traveled from region to region, you could hear people say that here Heracles fought this beast, here he built this altar, here he rested under this tree. Heracles was not the only hero whose life spanned great distances. Perseus, whose story belongs to an earlier generation in the mythic family tree, also walked at the edge of the known. His mother, Danae, was locked in a bronze chamber because her father, king of Argos, had been warned that his grandson would one day cause his death. Zeus visited her as a shower of golden light, seeping through cracks in the metal and settling gently upon her. From that strange union, Perseus was born. Cast into the sea in a chest with his mother, he washed ashore on a distant island, was raised by a humble fisherman, and eventually found himself forced to attempt a task that should have killed him. He was sent to bring back the head of Medusa, the Gorgon whose gaze turned living flesh into stone. The path to her lair wound past strange lands, and along the way Perseus received help from the gods. Hermes gave him a curved blade and winged sandals that could carry him through the air. Athena lent him a polished shield in which he could see Medusa's reflection without meeting her direct gaze. From the mysterious Graiai, 3 old sisters who shared a single eye between them, he wrested knowledge of the way to the Gorgons. The lair itself was a place of cold and eerie stillness, strewn with stone shapes that had once been men. With his divine tools, Perseus crept close, looking not at Medusa but at her image in the bright shield. A swift blow took her head. From her neck sprang Pegasus, a winged horse, and the warrior Chrysaor, in some versions of the tale, as if the death of the monster released strange powers that had been coiled within her. Perseus carried the severed head away in a sack, knowing that its deadly gaze still held power even in death. Later, he would use it to rescue Andromeda, a princess chained on a rocky shore, as an offering to a sea creature, and finally offer the head to Athena, who set it upon her shield as a symbol of petrifying resolve. Where Heracles stands for raw strength, Perseus suggests a mix of divine favor and clever use of gifts. Then there is Theseus, the hero of Athens, whose story has the flavor of city politics woven into myth. In the countryside of Attica, roads were once dangerous, infested with bandits and brutes. As Theseus traveled toward Athens, he cleared the paths of such figures, each with their own grisly habit. One flung travelers with a giant club, another bent them to fit an iron bed. Theseus treated each villain as they treated others, turning their own cruelty back upon them. This series of encounters gave him a reputation, even before he reached the city. Yet his most famous deed lay elsewhere, on the island of Crete, where we have already walked in an earlier chapter. King Minos ruled there, proud and harsh. Through old quarrels and defeats, Athens had become bound to send a tribute of youths and maidens every few years to Crete. There they were fed to a monster, half man and half bull, that lived in a great labyrinth beneath the palace at Knossos. This creature, the Minotaur, had been born from another tangled story of Poseidon's anger and royal deceit. Theseus sailed with the doomed group, determined to end the tribute. When he reached Crete, the daughter of Minos, Ariadne, fell in love with him. She gave him a sword and a ball of thread, instructing him to tie one end at the entrance of the maze and unwind it as he walked. In the depths, among twisting corridors and echoing stone, he met the Minotaur and killed it. Then, following the line of the thread, he found his way back to the light. That thread is one of the most enduring images in Greek myth. It is used to speak about reason guiding someone through confusion, or a single idea that runs through a complex work. It also speaks of how one person's kindness, in this case Ariadne's, can be the difference between success and death. Of course, the story does not grant Ariadne a simple happy ending. Theseus takes her away but abandons her on the island of Naxos, where Dionysos finds her and makes her his bride. The hero saves his city, but he leaves behind a trail of broken promises. If we look for a story where many heroes gather in one place, we come to Jason and the Argonauts, a myth that is almost a catalogue of heroic types. Jason was the rightful heir of Iolcos in Thessaly, but his uncle Peleus had taken the throne. When Jason came to claim his place, Peleus did not kill him outright. Instead, he sent him on a quest that should have ended in disaster. Jason was told to sail to the far land of Colchis and bring back the golden fleece, the shining wool of a magical ram that had once flown through the sky with a child upon its back. To accomplish this, Jason had a ship built, the Argo, sturdy and swift. The Argo was said to contain in its prow a speaking timber taken from the sacred grove of Zeus at Dodona, so that the ship itself sometimes gave warnings. Jason invited the greatest heroes of Greece to join him, and they came in a great gathering, some of them known from other tales. Heracles joined for a time. Theseus appears in some lists. Orpheus, the musician whose song could calm beasts and even stones, was there to steady hearts and perhaps the sea itself. The voyage of the Argo took them past many wonders. They encountered the women of Lemnos, who had killed their husbands and now lived without men until the arrival of the Argonauts. They visited Phineus, a blind seer tormented by bird women called Harpies, who snatched his food and freed him by driving the Harpies away. They passed through the clashing rocks, two great cliffs that smashed together whenever a ship tried to pass. By sending a dove through first and timing their row strokes, they slipped between the closing jaws of stone. In Colchis, on the far shore of the Black Sea, Jason met King Aeetes and his daughter Medea. The golden fleece hung on a tree in a grove sacred to Ares, guarded by a sleepless serpent. Aeetes promised Jason the fleece if he could yoke fire-breathing bulls, plow a field with them, and sow it with dragon teeth that would sprout into armed warriors. With the aid of Medea, who was skilled in powerful magic and fell in love with Jason, he succeeded. An ointment she gave him protected him from fire. When the warriors sprang from the earth, he threw a stone among them so that they turned on each other. Medea then helped him lull the serpent and steal the fleece. The escape was stained with blood. In some versions, they killed Aeetes' brother to slow their pursuers, scattering the pieces in the sea so that the king would have to stop and gather them for burial. In the long run, Jason's ingratitude toward Medea would lead to horror, but at this point in the great chain of Greek stories, the voyage of the Argo stands as an early attempt to gather a whole generation of heroes around one timbered deck. These tales of monster slaying and long journeys are more than entertainments. Through them, ancient listeners explored their fears of the sea, of strange lands, of the wilderness beyond their fields. A lion that no weapon can pierce suggests the awe felt toward the unknown predators of untamed hills. A many-headed serpent that grows stronger when struck mirrors the way some problems become worse when handled without thought. A labyrinth speaks of confusing politics and the twisting streets of a palace that might hide terrors below. The golden fleece brings to mind the wealth promised by distant trade and the risk of trusting foreign kings. At the same time, the heroes themselves are not clean or simple figures. Heracles is both savior and destroyer, prone to terrible fits that can wipe out his own family. Perseus and Theseus leave behind injured women. Jason gains glory but betrays Medea. There is a sense that to reach so high, to stand with one foot in the mortal world and one near the divine, carries a cost that is paid in broken ties. Still, for the Greeks who told and listened to these stories on long evenings and festival days, the heroes stood as markers along the path of history. Before them was the age of gods alone, when the sky and sea settled. After them would come a time when gods withdrew a little, and human cities began to rise in clearer outline. The heroes were the bridge, walking with spear and club, and clever thread across the space between. By the time the age of heroes reached its height, the world of Greek myth felt crowded. There were cities along rocky coasts, ships pulling into harbors with painted eyes on their prows, kings whose power rested on storehouses full of grain and jars of oil, warriors in bronze who strapped on their armor as the sun rose pure and sharp over the Aegean. The gods still walked among mortals in disguise, but the stage belonged more and more to human figures with very human angers and desires. Among all the stories of this age, one rises higher than the rest, like a single tower seen above a whole city. It is the tale of Troy. To the Greeks, Troy was both a real city and a place of legend. They pictured it on the eastern side of the narrow strait that leads from the Aegean to the Black Sea, a place where trade routes pass and winds shift suddenly. Archaeologists in our world have dug at that spot and found layer after layer of walls, burnt debris, and fallen stones, proof that real settlements stood there for centuries. The myth does not match every detail of the soil, but it clings to this patch of earth as ivy clings to old stone. The seeds of the Trojan War were planted far away from its walls, among the gods themselves. On a certain day there was a wedding between Peleus, a mortal king of Thessaly, and Thetis, a sea nymph whose shape flowed like water and whose friendship with the old sea god Nereus made her a figure of power. Zeus himself arranged the match, partly to avoid a prophecy that Thetis' child by any god would be greater than his father. Better to see her marry a mortal, whose child would be mighty but not a threat to the throne of heaven. The gods gathered for the wedding feast, but one figure was not invited. Eris, spirit of strife, arrived anyway, furious at being left out. She did not shout or curse. Instead, she tossed a golden apple into the hall. On its surface were inscribed 3 words that have caused no end of trouble in many tongues. For the fairest. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite each reached for it. None of them would back down. Zeus, called upon to judge, refused to place himself between 3 goddesses whose anger could shake heaven. Instead, he sent them to be judged by a mortal, a prince of Troy named Paris. Paris was a shepherd at that time, raising flocks on Mount Ida above the Trojan plain. He had been given away as an infant because of a dream that warned his parents he would bring ruin on the city. But he had survived and grown into a handsome young man. When Hermes brought the 3 goddesses to him and placed the golden apple in his hand, he found himself in a position that would bend the fate of nations. Each goddess offered a bribe. Hera promised him royal power, over many lands. Athena promised victory in war and unmatched wisdom. Aphrodite promised him the most beautiful woman in the world as his bride. Paris looked at their shining faces and chose desire. He gave the apple to Aphrodite. In that moment, he set in motion the Trojan War. The most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, daughter of Zeus and Leda, married to Menelaus, king of Sparta. Many men had wished to marry her when she came of age. Her mortal father, Tyndareus, had wisely asked all her suitors to swear an oath that they would defend her chosen husband if anyone ever tried to take her away. Menelaus won her hand. The others accepted his victory, but they did so under this binding promise. When Paris traveled to Sparta, he was welcomed as a guest. Hospitality was sacred. Menelaus treated him with honor and courtesy. In return, Paris stole his wife. Some say Helen went willingly, enchanted by the power of Aphrodite. Others say she was taken by force. The poets never fully agree, and that uncertainty adds a shadow to her role. Whether seduced or compelled, she sailed with Paris to Troy, and the oath sworn by her former suitors flared into life. Menelaus' brother, Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, called upon the other Greek kings to honor their pledge. Messengers went out across the islands and along the coasts. Old promises were recited. Ships were prepared in dozens of harbors. The names of those who answered became the roster of a vast army. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, who had tried to feign madness to avoid the war but was revealed, joined with his keen mind and restless spirit. Achilles came from fear, the greatest warrior of his generation, born of Peleus and Thetis, carrying armor that seemed to glow with the light of another world. Ajax, a giant of a man from Salamis, brought his strength. Nestor came from sandy Pylos, old, wise, and full of stories from earlier days. At Aulis, a windy harbor on the coast of central Greece, the fleets gathered. The sea did not cooperate. Calm winds or contrary gusts kept the ships from sailing. A seer named Calchas declared that Artemis was angry and that Agamemnon had offended her. To gain a fair wind, he must sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia. In some versions he did so, staining the altar with the blood of his child. In others, the goddess snatched the girl away at the last moment and left a deer in her place. Either way, the story leaves a deep sense that even before the Greeks set foot on Trojan soil, the war had already exacted a terrible price. At last the winds shifted. The fleet stretched across the water, black-hulled ships with rowers at their benches and warriors gripping spears and shields. You can imagine the noise, the creak of oars, the shouted orders, the clink of armor. Beyond the horizon lay Troy, a city that had grown rich from its command of trade routes and from the fertile plain that spread before its walls. The war that followed did not last a single summer or even a handful of years. In the oldest accounts, it dragged on for 10 long seasons. The Greeks, or Achaeans as Homer calls them, camped on the beach with their ships drawn up on the sand. They raided the surrounding countryside, cut down orchards, drove off cattle, and sacked smaller towns allied with Troy. The Trojans fought back and were supported by allies from across Asia Minor and beyond, from Lycia and Thrace and other lands whose names were familiar to Bronze Age traders. The Iliad, the oldest surviving epic of the war, does not tell the whole story from beginning to end. It focuses instead on a narrow span of days near the end, when the anger of one man nearly destroys his own side. That man is Achilles. Achilles was the finest warrior among the Greeks, swift of foot, almost invincible in battle. His mother, Thetis, knew that his life would be short if he went to Troy. In one version, she tried to hide him among women, disguised in a dress, until Odysseus exposed him by laying out weapons and jewelry together and watching which objects drew his eye. In another, she had dipped him as a baby in the river Styx, holding him by the heel so that every part of him but that small patch was made proof against weapons. Whatever the details, the Greeks believed that Achilles carried both greatness and doom within him. The quarrel that drives the Iliad begins with a captured woman, Briseis, whom Achilles had taken as a prize from a sacked town. Agamemnon, forced to give up his own captive to appease Apollo and end a plague, took Briseis from Achilles in compensation. It was a public insult, an attack on the honor of a man whose sense of prestige burned as hot as his skill in battle. Achilles withdrew from the fighting. He sat by his ships and let his comrades fall. Without him, the Trojans under the proud and noble Hector pushed the Greeks back, burning ships and threatening to drive them into the sea. The gods took sides. Athena, Hera, and Poseidon favored the Greeks. Apollo, Aphrodite, and Ares leaned toward Troy. Zeus tried to keep the balance, but was swayed at times by pleas and bribes. The battlefield became a place where spears and blades clashed, but also where divine hands deflected blows or added weight to them. At last, moved by pity and the pleading of his closest companion, Patroclus, Achilles allowed his friend to wear his armor and lead the Myrmidons into battle. The sight of what seemed to be Achilles rallied the Greeks and stunned the Trojans, but Patroclus, carried away, pushed too far. Apollo struck him, stripping away his strength, and Hector killed him. The fall of Patroclus was a blow that broke something inside Achilles more deeply than the loss of Briseis ever had. His grief turned to a cold and consuming rage. The image of him, smeared with ash, weeping beside the body of his friend, speaking to the silent face, is one of the most moving in the epic. When at last he returned to battle, he did so not for the honor of Agamemnon or the cause of the Greek army, but for his own vengeance. He slaughtered Trojans in a fury, fought the river itself when its waters rose against him, choked with corpses, and met Hector before the walls. Their duel was both personal and cosmic. Hector had stood as Troy's greatest defender, a good son to Priam, a loving husband to Andromache, a father who had lifted his child into his arms while wearing the plume of his helm. He faced Achilles knowing he could not truly match him. In the end, Achilles killed him, tied his body to his chariot, and dragged it around the walls, dust coating the once proud limbs, a spectacle that horrified even the gods. Yet the story does not leave Achilles in pure savagery. One night, old King Priam, guided by Hermes, slipped into the Greek camp. He entered the hut of Achilles and knelt before his enemy, kissing the hands that had killed his son. He begged for Hector's body, speaking not as a king but as a father, saying that he had done what no man should ever be forced to do, to put his lips on the hands of the man who had destroyed his child. Achilles, moved by the sight of this frail old man and reminded of his own father, wept. He saw that grief binds enemies as well as friends. He agreed to return Hector's body, and grant the Trojans time for a proper funeral. For a moment, in that quiet tent lit by a single fire, the rage that had consumed him eased, and two men on opposite sides of a war shared bread and sorrow. The Iliad ends with Hector's burial, not with the fall of the city, but later poets and storytellers filled in the rest. They told how Achilles himself was killed by an arrow shot by Paris, guided by Apollo, which struck his one vulnerable spot. They told how a plan was made to break the stale siege that had lasted so long. The Greeks built a great wooden horse, hollow within, large enough to hold a picked group of warriors. The rest of the army pretended to sail away, burning their camp and leaving the horse on the shore as an offering. The Trojans, descending from their walls, argued over what to do with it. Some said burn it where it stood, others said drag it through the gates as a trophy. A man named Laocoon threw a spear into its flank and warned that he feared the Greeks even when they brought gifts. Serpents rose from the sea and killed him and his sons, a sign some took as divine punishment for his words. In the end, the Trojans brought the horse into the city. At night, while the people slept after a day of celebration, the hidden warriors crept out, opened the gates, and signaled to the fleet that had turned back and waited just out of sight. The Greeks poured into the city, fires rose, Priam was killed at the altar of Zeus in his own courtyard, women and children were taken as captives. The old city that had stood as a symbol of wealth and strength turned black with smoke and fell. Not all the Trojans perished. In later Roman legend, Aeneas, a cousin of Hector, carried his old father on his shoulders and led a band of survivors out of the burning streets, guided by dreams and omens. His descendants, so that story goes, would one day found Rome, carrying a trace of Troy into a new power. Greek storytellers knew that myths travel and change as ships do, passing from shore to shore. As for the Greeks who survived, many did not find joy at home. Agamemnon returned to Mycenae to be murdered in his bath by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover, in vengeance for Iphigenia. Others were shipwrecked or wandered. The longest and strangest journey belonged to Odysseus. His voyage home, told in the Odyssey, took 10 years more. He and his men met lotus eaters who forgot their homes, the one-eyed giant Polyphemus whose cave they escaped by clinging to the bellies of his sheep, the witch Circe who turned men into swine, the sirens whose song promised knowledge, and the twin terrors of Scylla and Charybdis, a rock with a monster and a whirlpool that swallowed ships. He spent a year with the nymph Calypso on her lonely island, offered immortality and ease, yet he still longed for his mortal wife and his own hearth. All the while, the gods argued over his fate. Athena favored him, Poseidon resented him for blinding his son Polyphemus. The sense grows that, although the gods still influence the world, their presence has become more tangled, more distant. They no longer stride onto battlefields in gleaming armor as they did in the earliest tales. They work through storms, dreams, and subtle turns of chance. When at last Odysseus reached Ithaca and reclaimed his house, the great cycle of the Trojan War closed. The heroes who had sailed forth in a blaze of youth were dead, lost, or aged. The cities they had left behind were changing. In the centuries that followed, people would look back at that age as something both glorious and terrible, a time when the boundary between myth and memory blurred. In the quiet that followed, storytellers began to shift their focus. They spoke more often of real cities, of lawgivers, of philosophers and historians. The gods still received sacrifices, but they no longer felt as close as they once had. The age of myth was not over, exactly, but it stood further away, like mountains seen from a long distance in the clear light of late afternoon.